geopolitics is that it's often about the convergence of different interest groups. So the Greater Israel Project is not a project undertaken by Zionists alone. It's heavily supported by the military-industrial complex of the United States, which wants to control all trade routes in the Middle East. Russia and Iran has something called the North-South Corridor. China has something called the Belt and Road Initiative. Then there's something called the European, Middle East, India corridor. And the Middle East is really the center of all global trade, and whoever controls that real estate controls all global trade. The military-industrial complex, financial interests, City of London, Wall Street, they all want to see the Greater Israel Project achieved. So that's what geopolitics is. Wherever the most powerful groups, wherever the interests converge, is whatever happens. It was more like testing the waters. Israel believed that with decapitation strikes, it could overthrow the Iranian regime. And what it discovered was that the regime was far more cohesive, far more resilient than it could ever imagine. And in fact, you could argue that the decapitation strikes actually helped Iran because it removed an ossified bureaucracy from the military. Top generals were removed, which allowed more energetic, more younger, more innovative lieutenants to rise in the ranks. Also, the 12th-day war unified Iranian society, and it really removed all possibility of peace from the minds of the Iranian people. So if they're around two, and I believe, like most experts, that around two is imminent, then the Iranian people, the Iranian regime, will be much more unified. Israel, on the other hand, knows time is running out. Israel has really dug itself a huge hole. It cannot afford peace anymore. Its society right now is on the brink of civil war. Netanyahu is on the precipice. If there is peace, Netanyahu will be brought to trial and be charged with war crimes. So his only option is to continue the war. And so we're headed to a collision. And in this collision, I think that the stakes are much higher. I think that this war will be much more sustained. The two things I'm looking at in the second round is, first of all, will Iran close off the Strait of Hormuz? As you can imagine, if Iran were to close off the Strait of Hormuz, it would bring in the entire world. The entire world would be impacted. Southeast Asia, mainly China, South Korea, Japan, get most of its oil from the Middle East, and this would severely hamper the Southeast Asian economies. So that's the first big question. Will Iran close off the Strait of Hormuz? Second big question is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, as we discussed last time, Israel imported 5 red heifers from Texas. And this was like 3 years ago. So now the red heifer is all of age. And why you do this is you need to sacrifice a perfect red heifer in order to consecrate the grounds for the building of the third temple, the rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon. To do that, you have to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as you can imagine, this would cause tremendous political repercussions throughout the Islamic world. You could see revolution, civil discontent, even regime collapse and overthrow. So these are the two big questions that we would look at, that in geopolitics, the conflict within states is more intense, more great, and more important than the conflict between states. So the question then is, if you're working within a imperial bureaucracy, which is what the United States is, how do you obtain power? The problem with bureaucracies is that they're slow, they're compartmentalized, and they are extremely hierarchical. So the way you manipulate, or the way that you cheat in bureaucracies, is by forming secret societies, because secret societies allow for secret coordination, right? So people across departments who don't really know each other, they're working off a same script, and as such, they are able to ascend the bureaucratic ladder because they are able to tell each other apart, and they just help each other. The problem then is, what is a script? The script is often eschatological, a belief in the end of the world. And so for Freemasons, it's the belief in the creation of a world government. For Christian Zionists, it's the belief of the return of Jesus. For religious Talmudic Jews, a faction that we often refer to as the Frankish Talmudic Jews, they want to see the coming of the Messianic age. But the thing is that with all these eschatologies, they have a similar script. So the script involves Israel fighting World War III, the building of the Third Temple, the return of the Jews to the homeland, the coming of the Antichrist. So what is interesting is that these are different secret societies, and they're often in competition with each other. But for the purpose of eschatology, they work together. So, and what's important for us to understand is that these different secret societies are heavily embedded in the American national security apparatus, CIA, the Pentagon, the FBI, as well as government of Israel. And for the longest time, these secret societies were dormant because they really couldn't achieve their eschatology. But with the collapse of the global liberal financial order, with Brexit, with the rise of Donald Trump, with this war in Ukraine, these secret societies see an opportunity to achieve their eschatological vision. And they're working directly with religious fanatics in the state of Israel. So I would say that Israel is not working alone. I would say that Israel is working very much in conjunction with the national security apparatus of America. Yeah, so what's happening in Gaza, the upcoming war with Iran, the Houthis, Lebanon, it's all interconnected, right? Because Israel sees the Axis of Resistance as one enemy headed by the snake in Tehran. So from a Israeli perspective, all these things are interconnected. And you can make the argument that this pause in Gaza is so that Israel can prepare properly for the upcoming war against Iran. But as you say, this ceasefire, I mean, it's not really a ceasefire. Israel continues to commit atrocities every day. And you can make the argument that Israel just cannot stop because Israel has reached a breaking point where if it stops, then it needs to look in the mirror and account for all the atrocities it's committed in Gaza for the past 2 years. And they can't do that. It would just mean a fracturing of Israeli society. It would mean the breaking down of the Greater Israel Project. It could possibly mean the end of Zionism. So unfortunately, the situation is that Israel has gone all in. As I've said in previous videos and previous lectures, I believe that what's happening in Gaza is a ritual human sacrifice. And this is something that the Aztecs did, this is something that the Romans did, the Spartans did. You do that because you're at war and you need to commit your entire population to total war. So if there's ever peace, then there's always a risk that the Palestinians will one day seek vengeance against Israel for what's happened, and the Israelis cannot allow that. Also, what the Israelis understand is that this war in Gaza, it's made the Palestinian people more resilient, more energetic, more dynamic, more innovative. And if they allow the Palestinians time to rebuild the society, it's going to cause a lot of issues for Israel in the future because the Greater Israel Project cannot allow for a Palestinian state to stand. Unfortunately, the Chinese theory of geopolitics, it's very clear, it's very stark, and it's pretty consistent. It's been consistent for decades. China will never, ever interfere in a conflict that does not involve Chinese territory or sovereignty issues. It just does not. First of all, it doesn't really have the capacity to fight an overseas war. The People's Liberation Army, it's very much a defensive army. It's meant to defend the territorial sovereignty and integrity of China. It doesn't have a theory of geopolitics. It would be very hard to explain to Chinese why it's important to get involved in a war in Iran. The Chinese population would not stand for it. And the Chinese doesn't really even have a blue water navy. So the Chinese Navy, it's hemmed in by the three island chains of the United States. So if Chinese ships were ever to go off to the Middle East, then it would be stranded. It could be easily picked off by the American military or the Israeli Air Force. So unfortunately, China cannot involve itself in a war with Iran. But what China sees itself is maybe the last defender of the global order. And so what China would do is try to broker a peace between Iran, the United States, and Israel, even as the war is raging. So that's how China would perceive itself in a possible conflict, that it would be a mediator, that it would try to reconcile these different interests. But at the same time, it would continue to trade with both the United States and Iran in case of a conflict. Even as the war rages, there will always be secret negotiations going on among different parties. And I think that Beijing will be one of the facilitators of these secret negotiations. And I think that an agreement will be reached where China is allowed to provide material and weaponry to Iran, and the United States will turn a blind eye. And this is essentially what happened in Ukraine, right? NATO supplied intelligence, weaponry, special forces, targeting to the Ukrainians, and the Russians turned a blind eye. And so I think that war is a much more complicated affair than most people assume. Also, I had to say this, but all these nation states are cynical. So there could be a situation where America, Israel is fighting a war against Iran, but American companies, Israeli companies are providing certain material to the Iranians for a lot of money. Okay, so war is a very complicated affair, and we can't just say that when the United States goes to war against Iran, that's it. It's the finish. At the end of the day, I keep on saying this, but the conflict within nation states is much greater than conflict between nation states. So when a war happens, it's often as a way to deflect from the greater domestic tensions within a nation state. In mid-August in Anchorage, and they had a very good meeting, and it seemed both were very happy with the results of the meeting. And right after the meeting, as you mentioned, conflicts start to arise everywhere. So Trump started to send the American Navy to Venezuela. Putin sent more drones against NATO countries. So the question then is, what was the point of that Anchorage meeting? And many people believe that it was for peace. But if you change your perspective and said, maybe it was for war purposes, maybe Putin and Trump agreed to fight even more. So the question then is, why would they do that? Well, both Trump and Putin have a common enemy. And the common enemy is the global financial establishment order, which has controlled the world ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Remember, George H.W. Bush announced the creation of the New World Order. And what did that mean? It meant that these different elites of these different countries, China, Russia, United States, Europe, would get together and they would steal from their own people. So these are parasites. And both Trump, Putin see the global establishment elite as the real enemy. They see NATO, they see the American, European deep states, they see the EU as the common enemy. And so how do you destroy the global financial order? Well, you drag them into a war that's not winnable, that would cause tremendous popular discontent within their nations, and which would lead to the overthrow of their respective deep state regimes. And I think that's the strategy that Putin and Trump have mapped out. So I think that this war in Ukraine, what's happening in Venezuela, it's all just a reflection of that.